everyone.
You
Good evening.
we're just gonna give it a few more minutes because I think Linda, Jenna said you did not get the link, so I'm gonna give it a few minutes to
No,
see. I just resent
I
it. So
got an email from you that said
mm,
Bible study, but
okay.
that link that I asked Jenna about then tonight and she forwarded it to me, that was not part of my email.
You
Um
didn't see invite on the same link Tammy sent?
No.
Uh,
Uh-uh. And then the whole email disappeared. I couldn't
Mine
even
said
find
join
the
meeting
email.
now or something like join meeting now, I think it said.
Hi, John.
hi,
Yes,
John.
but
Oh,
that was earlier today that she sent it, and no, I didn't have any of that as part of hers,
wow.
so I don't know what happened. But Jenna forwarded it to me.
just give me 1 second. We kind of have a pastoral situation. Just give me 1 second.
Okay.
Um
Did you stay home today, John?
Yes. Although it turned out to be not that big a deal, really.
Oh, it's been very windy here. I'm nervous about the really tall trees out in front of my condo.
We did drive about 4 o'clock. We did drive down to Seabright, and that road was flooded. We had to turn around.
Oh, yes, I would think.
And it didn't. I was reading, different reports. Didn't seem that bad, and it wasn't for most of the way. But we got halfway through Ocean Avenue and said nope. And there were cars and gotten stuck actually.
Days like this is when I'm glad I don't live on Pag Circle anymore because we used to have to park out on Winding Way or someplace, or
Yeah.
half the time you couldn't get over the little bridge to get to our street, or had to go around. Then it would flood all the way up to our front porch.
oh,
And we made the mistake when we first built the house of putting mulch down around the flower beds, landscaping beds in the front. So our yard was always full of landscape mulch
Mhm.
Oh,
chips.
geez.
right.
So then we changed to having rocks down there. Worked
Pretty
a lot.
street though.
Yeah, it was a nice street. It was a nice place to live.
Hi, Tammy.
Hi, Lydia. Hi, John. So you know what? Let's get started with prayer, and then if anybody else comes in, I know Susan was planning on coming. I don't know what happened with Nancy, but we'll just get started because we're taping, and we can share the tape for whoever can't make it tonight. The Lord be with you.
Also with you.
Also.
Let us pray. Gracious and loving God, we thank you for bringing us together again to celebrate and study your word and your wisdom. We pray, O Lord, that you be with us tonight and help us to understand these really difficult texts. And most of all, we ask you to help us to apply these texts to our lives. It can be really hard with ancient texts. And so we pray for the wisdom and the guidance to be able to do that. We pray also for all those who are suffering from the effects of this storm. May be with them, O gracious Lord, and bring us help and healing. All this we ask in the name of your Son, our Savior, Jesus Christ. Amen. So welcome back, everybody. Barbara is back in the house with us.
Yes.
And here we are after all this time. And so I assume everybody has finished reading Genesis, or
Well, I was confused because the bulletin said Genesis 12, and I thought, oh gosh, we've
Mhm.
done that lots of times.
Yeah,
So-
we've been there, done that. Yeah. So Amy had asked me, and I'm like, I can't remember honestly. I just know that we have gone past the last we met. Abram and Sarah were in Egypt. Is that correct?
Yes.
And so we talked
they
about
had
Abraham and
Right.
yeah. So that means tonight we're going to move on to Abram and Lot separating in 13. But before we do that, right? So I'm really hoping that as we move forward, we can make these texts really relatable to you, right? Because as I said, these are really ancient texts, and sometimes they can be like, well, this means nothing to me. This text tonight, believe it or not, if you've read 13 or you've reread it in preparation for tonight, it has a lot of significance for us today. And it might not seem like that on the surface, but I'm hoping that I'll be able to kind of guide you into the story because moving forward, that's really important. You want to be able to not just know these stories as like just a study education, right? You want to be able to do something with these texts. And this story tonight actually has a lot of meat in it that we can do that. So, any thoughts or comments about this text before we move on to breaking it down? So the story of Abram and Sarah, right, is a bit difficult. We see God calling Abram um to leave everything behind and just start this new life. Remember the Hebrew the original Hebrew isn't just like leave where you live. It's everything that separates you from Yahweh, right? Leave all of that behind you and just essentially start your life over. And Abram's pretty good in responding to that call, right? Some scholars are unsure if Abram's father actually got the call, Terah, and just kind of didn't heed it, got as far as he got, right, and stopped. And then Abram is called to take the second part of the journey to Canaan. We don't know, and it really doesn't matter whether that's true or not. What matters is that he's fairly faithful in this call, except for the fact that he doesn't exactly cut ties with his family. He takes his nephew with him, who is an orphan, right? His brother has died, and he kind of assumes responsibility for him. It's not really what God calls him to do. And so the promise that God makes to Abram is never really fulfilled, right? There's a lot of diversions that happen. And and it's really because Abram's not been faithful to his part. He's only listened to God part of the way. And the reason that Abram's not totally faithful to this is that while he trusts God, he doesn't fully trust God 100%, right? He wants to have something tangible to make sure, just in case God fails, that this promise is still going to happen, right? And that tangible thing is Lot, because Abram at this point is in his golden years, and Sarah, who's never been able to produce children, is also in hers. It seems very unlikely when this God appears and says, I'm going to give you an heir, that I'm going to make you a great nation. It seems impossible. And while I believe that Abram wants to trust this, he is like us, right? He hears God's promise, but can only take it so far. And when it starts to sound very unbelievable and impractical, which it is, he wants to make sure he has plan B to help God along. And so Lot is his plan B. And as a result, things get kind of messed up and dicey for him, right? And there's a famine in Egypt, excuse me, in Canaan, which happens all the time, right? They are prone to famine. This is a severe famine because the word is repeated so much. Hi, Nancy. The narrator repeats famine so much, right? Whenever you see Hebrew words repeated, it's to stress, draw our attention to that, to emphasize that. We've given it an emphasize emoji today. And so this famine is really bad. And although God has made all these promises to Abram, he still doesn't trust them. And he goes to Egypt. He takes matters into his hand and into his own hands, and he goes to Egypt to save himself. And in doing that, he puts Sarah at tremendous risk, right? He asks her to compromise herself, to lie, to save his own skin. And she does. And it puts her in danger. It puts the promise at danger, right? Because Pharaoh could have easily killed them, and things are just a mess. And yes, Abram gets out of that situation despite himself. Remember, the promise is never about Abram as a person, it's about God. And so while Abram has shown very bad behavior and will at times show very bad behavior, God's promise sticks, right? Because it's about God, not Abram. And so Abram gets out of that situation. And now things in 13 start to turn around for him. We see a different side of Abram. Now, scholars today will say that these are two different traditions. 12 and 13 were never written at the same time. They were not meant to go together. These are just traditional stories in the Abram narrative. But there was a really, really brilliant redactor who took these two stories and put them together for a purpose, for a theological purpose. Were you able to catch that? Do you have some ideas what that theological purpose might be?
No.
So the one, right, the one shows a very self-centered, fallible Abram. This story in 13 is going to show an Abram who is honoring God's promise and is being extremely faithful to God's promise. And because of that, things are going to change. And there's going to be a turn for Abram because he is no longer being self-centered. He is trusting God. And he is putting his faith in God, and then there's this great turnabout for him. So where is he putting his faith in God? So this story focuses on something we call the theology of land, right? Which is really important for us today. We tend in our society to presume scarcity, right? Doesn't matter what kind of political structure we have, whether it's capitalism or socialism or Marxism, everything presumes scarcity. And so that presumption results in a lot of fierce competition, right? Why we have poverty today when God has given us all the resources we need to feed everybody in the world 5 times over. Why is there hunger? Why is there food insecurity? Because we work on what we call a presumption of scarcity, right? We always think that there's never going to be enough. We don't have faith and trust in God's providence. And so we try to hoard whatever resources we can for ourselves, right? And in this story, we find that, you know what, God really does provide. And there is this providence of God. And this presumption of scarcity that we run on is what really, really screws us up, right? If we allow God's purpose and plan and promise to fulfill itself and just run its natural course, we don't have to worry about where anything is going to come next, right? But because we don't, we've diverted God's purpose and plan, and so we do have scarcity. So we do have poverty. And how do we see this in this story, right? Well, we see it by Abram relinquishing control and allowing Lot to choose where he wants to go. Right. So we see in the beginning of the story, does this make sense so far?
Yeah.
Sure.
And the idea behind this being, you know what, everything belongs to God. We're just stewards of that. Everything belongs to God. It doesn't belong to us personally. And that's really what's behind this, right? And Abram's going to trust that. And because he's going to trust that, God is going to renew this promise to him. So what happens? Let's look at the beginning of this. So it tells us, so Abram went up out from Egypt, right? This is kind of the reverse. This is kind of just, going to foreshadow the Exodus. He goes out of Egypt. He's on the right course, right? He's got his wife. He's got all this stuff. Remember, before they leave, Pharaoh has kind of given him all the silver and gold. He's the first person in the Old Testament to have all this wealth. He's a very wealthy man, right? Don't mistake him for just this Bedouin who has nothing. He's not. He's got clout, right? And they come out of Egypt. And right, he's very rich in livestock and gold. And it's really funny because we don't hear anything about Lot until verse 5, right? There's a separation. There's a separation already from Lot and Abram. This is the beginning of the separation. That Lot is like almost like an afterthought. He's mentioned later on in the text. We hear about Abram, right, being very rich in all of this livestock and the silver and gold. And he's traveling, right? He's traveling stages by stages, right? He's still a nomad. He's traveling, and he's working his way out of Egypt, right? Scholars will tell us that this is also a metaphor for his spiritual journey as well as it is his physical journey. And he's traveling, and then all of a sudden, almost like this afterthought. Now Lot, who went with Abram, he also has become very wealthy, right? Egypt has made them both very wealthy. And there's a problem, right? What is the problem?
They couldn't live together because they had too much money. or
Yeah,
too
they've
much
got too
stock,
much.
Whatever.
Yeah, so they can't no longer share the same land, right? Because they've got too much stuff. And interestingly enough, it's not Abram that brings that to their attention, right? It's not Abram or Lot. Who is it?
It's the herdsman.
Yeah,
They're
they're
herd-
herdsmen. The herdsmen start
Yeah.
arguing, right? There's strife between their herdsmen, right? And they start to argue about what they're going to do with this situation. And so Abram goes to him, right? Abram is the good uncle, the good doubting uncle. And what happens? What does he tell him?
He says, you pick and I'll abide by your pick. Let's not have any dissension here.
Yeah, and what do you all think about that?
Well,
Is
it's
that-
gracious?
It's gracious, right? In what
Yeah.
way is it gracious?
It's sort of, after you, or
Mhm.
you choose, and
Mm-hmm.
you go first.
Yeah.
He gave him the pick of the litter, really.
He was giving them a
Right.
pick of the litter, right? That's pretty unexpected, wouldn't you think?
Yes,
Right? He's the elder uncle, right? He's
rather
the
magnanimous. Yeah,
patriarch. What's that, Nancy?
rather magnanimous. I mean, to just say the choice is yours.
Yeah, and
Right.
certainly something he doesn't have to do, right? He's the patriarch of the family. He's the elder uncle. He doesn't have to do this, right? It would have been he could have even said to Lot, just get out of here, right? He doesn't. He doesn't. He doesn't view this from a self-centered perspective. Right. He's realizing that everything belongs to God and not him. He's not running on that presumption of scarcity. He's trusting in God's promise. He's trusting in God's providence. And he's acting on that faith. Right? Very, very much unlike the Abram who went running to Egypt. He is acting on his faith. He is acting on the promise that God has given him. And he's pretty convinced of it because he puts himself at risk, right? He doesn't know what Lot is going to say. And they are at this point where they're located right now is it's a hillside in the vicinity of Bethel, and it's about 3,000 feet above sea level. And he says this really amazing thing to Lot, right? They go out and they survey this land. They can see this whole extent of this land before their eyes, right? And he says to Lot, let there be peace amongst us. Like there's no reason for strife. I'm picking peace over any kind of problems between you and me and our herders, right? And now I want you to look out in front of you. And I want you to pick where you want to go. What
Okay.
land do you want yourself? And what happens?
Lot picks the good part.
Yeah,
Right,
Lot looks, right? And Lot in this case, does this sound familiar to you? Does this like ring a bell in something else we've read in our studies, like somebody's who looked at something and taken the taken like their eyes desire?
David.
David, yeah, oh yeah, David. Later to come, David, yeah, of course, with Bathsheba. Yeah, of course, right? We see a lot of this going on in the Hebrew Bible. What about prior to Abram? Who also who also looked with their eyes, right, and took what they wanted.
Adam and Eve.
Yeah, exactly, Linda, right. Eve looks with her eyes. And she says, to heck with all of these, stipulations of God. This looks good and I'm taking it. And in fact, the text is very much pattern on Eden, isn't it, right? We hear of this really lush oasis, right? What does the text tell us? That it's well watered, right? Lot looked about him and he saw that the plain of the Jordan was well watered everywhere, like the garden of the Lord, right? Like Eden and like the land of Egypt, right? And he takes it from himself. He doesn't care what God's plan is. He's not thinking about God. He doesn't care about his uncle. He doesn't care about anything, right? He cares about what he wants. And he takes it, just like Eve. He takes it. And then the author right? And then the narrator tells us this, right? He gives us this hint. This was before the Lord had destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah, right? And the idea being is that probably the readers of this text had well known what happened at Sodom and Gomorrah. They were very familiar with that story. And so they would have also been been very familiar that Sodom and Gomorrah is associated with evil. That now Lot is choosing evil over God. And he's doing it for self-centered reasons, right? So Lot chose for himself all the plain of the Jordan. And what does it say in 11b? And then he does that other thing.
He travels eastward and they
He,
separate.
he travels eastward, right?
Yeah,
Remember,
right.
he goes to the east, all that awful stuff. Remember, right? When Cain gets, Adam and Eve are sent east when they're dispelled from the garden. After Cain kills Abel, he's sent east, even further east than Adam and Eve, right? Everything, every time you hear east in the Bible, right, you're going to know that's a tip off. This isn't not good. And Lot chooses to go east. He chooses something that's self-gratifying and God-defying.
Where the people were sinful.
Where people are sinful. Yes, Linda. So while Lot historically gets this well-watered plain, right? Lots of rivers running into this, doesn't have to worry about anything. Abram actually historically gets this ridge where, like, if it rains, it's a prayer. You gotta really pray to God to get some rain. It's barren, it's desert, it's arid. Abram is still dwelling with God, right? It doesn't matter that he is in this place that would look like death, right? He's dwelling with God. And even though Lot has gone on to this Eden, it is far separated from God. He has chosen to go to the evil side. Abram has chosen to remain on God's side. But he does it, right? Abram, right? In 12, we see Abram settled in the land of Canaan. So why this story, right? So there's a lot of scholars who will say, well, this story was originally part of a narrative of Lot's stories that were also tradition. And it would have explained why some Israelites were original Israelite. It's not even why some tribes, right, that were associated with Abram were part of the covenant, and some were on the outside. Well, yeah, those people went with Lot, right, and they become separated from the original Hebrews that were from Abram's line, right. there's a practical reason to this story. But theologically, it is telling us what happens when we make that choice, that intentional choice to take matters into our own hands, to take things that look really good in the world and satisfying and choose to do that knowing full well that's not part of God's purpose and plan. And we do, right? We make lots of choices based on our senses that we'd say this is something Jesus would never do, right? But we're very covetous of that. We desire that. And so before we even think about what's right and wrong, we grab it. Very much like Lot. Questions, comments about this? Does this help bring the story a little more home?
There's a lot more
Yes.
to it than I thought when I read it.
A lot more, John, right? Yeah. Yeah. And a lot more, and a lot more that speaks to our faith lives. Right? It becomes no longer just this ancient text, but it starts to speak to our lives, right? Because we also live as if there's a scarcity of everything, right? We don't think about a theology of land. We live as if everything's just a grab for the best. And to hell with everybody else, right? We, in that grab, we like to think that, because things belong to us. The earth belongs to us. It can do what I please with it. We don't go back to that theology of land where everything is really God's to begin with. And God's going to do what God's going to do with it. And, and this is the other, did somebody say something? I'm sorry.
No.
And so this is the other thing, there's a lot of people will say, well, what kind of God would force people off their land, right? And here comes these outsiders who have now taken over the Canaanites' land, right? But again, there's a theology to that. And I was talking to somebody this week who, we were talking about realizing that realizing the Torah is theology, right? And it is because there's some cruel things in the Torah. There's some cruel things in the Hebrew Bible, right? And again, I want you to read this as theology. And that doesn't mean there's not history behind it. But remember, Israel is this small nation that writes her history with God in a time when the stronger, more powerful God is the God that lands on top, right? And you're always out to prove that my God is stronger than your God. And Yahweh is a tribal God that's known, a lesser known God, but he is known. And so it would have been really important for Israel to make this point. Our God is stronger. Our God is the only God. Our God can do it. Remember those plagues, right? That were polemics against the Egyptian gods. The same is true here, right? So when people say, well, that was really cruel of God, that God kicked out all those Canaanites. Well, remember, there's a purpose to this, right? And the theological purpose to this is to say, well, you know what? It's God's land anyway. And God has the power to choose what God's going to do over that land. That makes a point. That makes a theological point. People who are reading the story aren't thinking like us. What a cruel God. He kicked all those Canaanites out. And if you really read the story of Abram anyway, right? God never says to Abram, go in there and proselytize, right? And make converts. And if they don't believe you, kill them. God never says that. Abram goes in to coexist with these people. There is a theology behind this, right? A statement about God. Remember, everything here tells about an attribute of God. This is the attribute of God. Everything belongs to God, and everything that we have is only because God has given it as a loan to us, right? So we think about when we talk about stewardship.
Interesting.
We are only how do I say, in charge of the land as on God's behalf, right? We don't own the land. We don't own anything in creation. We are stewards, and our job is to do what God would do with that land because it's on loan to us. And that's what this story is saying, right? The land belongs to God. And Abram was honoring that. He was honoring that by doing the God thing, right? He wasn't grabbing it for himself. He wasn't taking the best for himself. And he was doing it in the name of peace, right? Did not want strife with the nephew and decides, yeah, we can live in peace. But Lot is functioning under a whole other perception, chooses what's wrong intentionally. And we know what's going to happen in Lot's life, right?
Hmm.
No. His family's annihilated. He loses his home. He becomes the father to children created out of incest. His tribes become enemies of Israel, right? He has secured his fortune in very temporal ways. We can
But he
secure
is
our.
saved. He is saved from the destruction of Sodom, though.
He is, John. Yeah, and what do we make of that? He is saved. I mean,
I don't know. I'm not sure. I mean, but God comes to him, right? Tells him, instructs him,
does.
get out.
Right. And Abram makes that plea on his behalf. I mean, we'll see in the next chapter, right? The same thing when when he's caught up as like a prisoner of war, right? We see that in the next chapter when Abram again comes to his rescue.
Hmm.
But he's never part of the promise, right? And I think the other thing that you can say about this, and I think this is really important as we look ahead to the story of Sarah and Hagar, right, which is a really fascinating story. Remember what God tells Abram. You will be a blessing to people who bless you and a curse to people who curse you. Lot is still part of that household. He is still part of Abram's spear. And so maybe we look at his salvation not once but twice, right, at the hand of God, because he is part of Abram's orbit. That people are still receiving blessings from God because they're associated with Abram.
Just
And we
say that
start,
again, please.
and we're certainly not told in Scripture that they become enemies. They just go on to lead their own lives. And we're going to see that again in the story of Sarah and Hagar. Hagar is part of Abram's household and so receives this blessing because God promises Abram that, people who bless you will be blessed. And so part of Hagar's blessing, and especially with, Ishmael, who's given a promise to become a great nation, a big nation also, right, is because of her association with Abram. Abram is blessing people by association. And I would say there's a really good case to be made to Lot's double salvation in this story and his connection with Abram. God's promise, a blessing. Questions, comments?
It's funny, when I read it, I
Mhm.
didn't concentrate so much on Lot's decision, although it was one of greed. I kind of looked at it as though Abram made a decision to just trust that God would provide no matter what land he got. That's kind of what I thought. I didn't. I mean, all the bad things that happened with Lot, it all comes back he gets saved anyway. And I thought the same thing because of Abram's faith and trust that God would just provide. No matter what lands Lot picked, God would provide for Abram.
Yeah, and that's absolutely true, Barbara. That's absolutely true, right? That is definitely the crux of the story, right? Is that God is now, like, unlike his trip to Abram, unlike his trip to Egypt, where he took things into his own hands, unlike Abram's clinging on to Lot to be his heir, right? Now he has put full trust in God. The story shows that he is going to trust God. And even when he gets the short end of the stick, right? He's continuing to trust that God is going to provide. That is absolutely correct. The part with Lot, right, is just like kind of that side story that shows us what happens when we make these very selfish decisions. And when we make these selfish decisions based on, observation, it looks good, so I'm going to take it. And we certainly know that things that look good for us are usually not the things that are good for us. But human tendency will grab that. Right? That's just the second lesson that we can learn here. And again, always, these stories build on each other, right? The redactors put it together so that they build on each other. And we see, this went wrong with Eve, and now it's gone wrong again with Lot. Anyone else? And just so we don't forget, the narrator reminds us in 13, right? About Sodom were wicked. They were great sinners against the Lord. And the reference being now Lot is one of them. Lot has chosen to be one of them. Circumstances hasn't made that happen. Lot has chosen to be amongst the wicked. It's what happens. That's kind of when our foolishness chooses by sight what we want. That's the point. Right. And it's really interesting, right? If you notice, Lot doesn't say a word, right? There's no words from Lot. And we really think that's because the narrator is really imposing their feelings in here. Lot is not even worthy of words. So Lot is silent through this whole thing. Questions, comments? Then this really big thing happens in 14, right? The Lord said to Abram, after Lot had separated from him, right? That problem is now out of the way. And so then what does God do once they're separated?
Is that the granting of the covenant?
Yeah, yes. Mm-hmm. So God, brings up the covenant again, right? But this time it's expanded. The covenant, this original promise of God to make, Abram a great nation that we saw in 12 when he leaves Ur, right? And God promises to make him a great nation, right? But now it's expanded and there's like embellished words now, right? And notice the words that God's used, right? Raise your eyes now, right? In contrast to Lot, who looked and saw. But now God is telling, now you raise your eyes and look from the place where you are. And interestingly enough, and I don't know if you catch this, right? But God adds something to what we're told about when Lot chooses which land he wants, right? You can find it in 9, in 9C-ish? No, 9B. Let's say 9B. Abram tells Lot to essentially look to the left and the right, right? He says, separate yourself from me. If you take the left hand, then I will go to the right. Or if you take the right hand, then I will go to the left, like left and right. But God doesn't say that to Abram, right? God says, what does God tell Abram in 14?
Look north, south, east, west.
Yeah, he gives him a whole compass, right? All of this. It's not limited, all of this. The land that you see. Lot looked, his looking was limited and it was self-centered, but now God is saying to Abram, the whole compass, all four directions.
As much
This
as
is
he could see, right? As much
as
as he
far
could
as,
see, he could give him.
yep.
Right.
Everything you can see, right, is given to you. That also rings true with somebody else. Do you remember who that will also happen to? Will happen to Moses, right?
Oh, Moses.
That will take Moses up on Sinai and say, look, all of this is yours.
Hmm.
Look around, right? A lot of foreshadowing in this story. And then God makes these like embellishments, right? And he says to, like, it's no longer just to you and your descendants, but look, it's to you and your offspring forever, right? Why is there trouble in the Middle East today? Why is Israel in combat for this land, right? This is why they go back to the Abraham promise. All of this land belongs to you and your descendants forever. I will make your offspring like the dust of the earth, right? This is growing bigger and bigger, right? This is this embellished language that God is expanding the promise, right? Why? Because Abram has been faithful and Abram has trusted God. And now God is giving back that blessing. No, nothing in the way anymore, right? Lot is gone. Abram's done the right thing. He has trusted in God's providence. His faith is now going to pay off. God is expanding this promise, embellishing this promise. The progeny is going to be countless. What should have happened in Genesis now, but couldn't, because there was this, this problem that Abram hadn't fully listened to God. That's all gone away now, because now Abram has fulfilled his half of the deal, right? And then God tells Abram to do this really strange thing. What does he tell Abram to do that's like, wow, that's weird?
To get up and walk.
Yeah, to get up and walk the length and breadth of the land, right? And that seems really strange to us. Any ideas why God tells Abram that? And it's absolutely okay if you don't know. So that was like a really old custom in the ancient Near East, right? So when a new king would a new conqueror or new ruler would take over land, right? That's how they trace out the boundaries, right? That was their assertion. They'd be marking their territory. They would walk the boundaries, right? You see the Hittites doing that every year at a winter festival. The king would come and he'd walk the boundaries. So everybody knew that was the boundaries of your land, right? Baal does this. We see evidence of Baal doing this to assert his kingship over humans and the gods. He walks the breadth of the land. We also see it in the Old Testament again, right? We see it when the priest of in Joshua's day tell the army to carry the Lord's throne around the walls of Jericho. Pharaoh did it, right? Every year he would walk the boundaries of the land.
We used to do it from time to time at St. John's.
Did you really, John?
Yeah, Father Van Sant like that. We did it. We will go out. We would come out of the church, walk the meets and bounds.
On rogation days or just in general? Because you do it usually on rogation days.
Yeah, I mean, it wasn't like every year, but I certainly remember doing it once or more than once.
Did you know that's why you were doing it?
He explained it, and I would not have been able to recount the explanation other than there was a biblical connection. And it wasn't like, hey, everybody, we're going to go outside and walk. He explained why one would do that.
You
It
claim in
was
the
it was
territory.
something that, imprinting on you the place. the
Mhm.
sense-
It's very true. We should do that again in the spring. It's very true. Usually the church will do it on Rogation days. We did, I think, a small piece of that last year when we did ECS Sunday. It was actually a Rogation Day. And I think we did a very small piece. And a lot of churches on Rogation Sunday will actually walk the town they're in. And it's very biblical, right? That's how you claim territory for God or yourself,
When
right?
is that? When
Rogation
is
days?
Rogation? Yeah. I mean,
There's only
how
a
does
few. Yeah, there's only a few a year, Nancy. Usually one in spring, and I'm not sure the other ones. I would have to look that up. They're rotating. They're not
Oh,
consistent.
okay. To the
But
church
each
calendar.
Yeah, you have to look in the church calendar, but there's always
Yeah.
one in spring after Easter. And I want to say maybe the first Sunday after Easter. Like we don't really practice Rogation days, so I'm not like up on my Rogation days, like when they are but we should honor it. I mean it's a part of church tradition and it does have these biblical, meanings to it.
Yeah.
Because otherwise you read something like this, you're like, that sounds crazy. Why did God tell him to walk all around? Right? But it is the claiming of the land. And that's the way that readers would have understood it.
Okay.
And so they would have understood what that meant. They would have understood that that was God giving the land and Abram taking his legal stake, right? His claim to that land. It's legal. It's legally binding. It's not like, I'm just going to walk around and this is mine, but it is a legal stake to that land. Questions, comments? And I think that it's a really important thing to say here also. Did you notice what ends this chapter?
The building of the altar.
Yeah, exactly, John. And do you remember what that means, what that signifies?
Symbolic of a return to God.
Yes, excellent, John. It's symbolic
Well,
of a return to
I
God.
cheated. I made a note. I actually have my notes from last time we were met, and I see
Last
altar
time.
building.
That's
Symbolic of
okay.
return to God.
Right.
That's
So
okay. That's
it's only
okay.
by
And
note, not by memory.
No, that's okay. But now that you read your notes, it jarred your memory, right? No,
Yes.
that's good. You took that note. Yeah. So altar building is a return to God, right? Whenever we see in the Hebrew Bible somebody builds an altar, right? It signifies their return to God, and this is very significant here, right? Because Abram was lost in his journey with God, right? He was in Egypt, he did all this crazy stuff in Egypt, and this is really significant that he builds an altar. It represents that he has returned to God and he's ready to move forward in this role as a renewed person. His faith has been restored, his life has been renewed. He comes back a restored person and is ready to begin that journey. And like all of us, right? Again, remember, you want to attach this lesson to your own life, our own lives of faith, right? There are many times in our lives that we also go astray. And God is always waiting for that return, right? Again, remember the promise of God doesn't necessarily rely on our bad behavior because God expects us to have bad behavior. God expects us to go astray. We are saved when we look at the story of salvation through Christ, right? There's none of us that deserve that salvation, right? If God judged us in the light of salvation by our behavior, we're all condemned. But God doesn't, right? There's salvation because of who God is, not who we are. And our choice in that journey is to either have faith in that or not. Right? The promise is there for us. And we can be very much like Lot and defy God and choose what we choose in life for very selfish, self-centered reasons. Or we can be as faithful as possible to the promise, as we can, right? Because we can't be 100% positive, faithful, because we're fallible humans. And I think that's also another thing you want to look for in Genesis, as well as through the Hebrew Bible. The narrator never takes a side. Have you noticed that? The narrator never condemns anything. The narrator never praises anything. The narrator simply
Yeah.
tells a
No
story.
judgment. Yeah.
Right. Simply
Yeah.
tells a story and invites us into those stories to make our own call. So when we say, well, how rotten of Abram to have put his wife at danger, how rotten of Sarah in these upcoming stories when, she throws Hagar out, the narrator is always very neutral. And that is, I mean, there is some subtle hints, right? He doesn't give Lot a voice because he or she obviously doesn't agree with Lot's behavior, but there's never any judgment. There's never any condemnation. There's never any praise, right? And that is very deliberate. That's because the idea is for us to see ourselves in these stories and to make our own calls of how we're going to live our faith. It's very true of the Gospel of John also. Right? The Gospel of John gives us lots of quirky examples that aren't found in the other Gospels, right? The story of Nicodemus, the story of the adulterous woman, right? And the idea is for us to read them and put ourselves in those places and think, what would I do? The same as Genesis, right? The narrator is inviting us to put ourselves in those places and to see, firsthand, yeah, there's consequences when we don't choose right. But ultimately, it's up to us. Does that shed Genesis in another light?
Yeah.
Does that shed the Bible in another light? I mean, we see a lot of right and wrong in the prophets, and that's a totally different story. Right? Because the prophets are intended to bring us back to God. And so there's a lot of judgment in the prophets. But when we're just reading narratives like this, right? So it's totally on us.
Yeah.
So
Questions?
it's the grounding then of the whole concept of free will that then the New Testament explicates more.
Yeah, in what way, John? Could
Well,
you
the notion
elaborate?
that it is a choice. It
Mhm.
is a choice to follow God or not. The
Mhm.
I guess in New Testament terms, the grace is there. You don't have to do anything to earn it, but you do have to accept it, I guess. Is that right? Is that a fair statement?
Yeah. So you have to, yeah. So it is unmerited, right? That's why it's grace, is that we can't do anything. Like, there's that big debate in the New Testament about, um, justification by works or grace, right?
Right.
And they always seem to think that there's this battle between James, who praises works, right? And Paul, who says, no, you can't do anything and earn God's grace. It's already given to you. It's already yours, right? They are really not incompatible. And the reason, and that's a great next Bible study, right, would be the book of James, because it's so misunderstood. The reason that they're not incompatible is, does anybody want to say before I say?
No, go ahead.
is
I always
because we,
thought, I always thought it was
Mhm.
that would be the expression of your acceptance of God, of your
That's
acting.
exactly right. Yeah, that's exactly right, John, right? So it is the expression of, I mean, it's not going to get you to heaven because you work at a soup kitchen. That is your expression. That is the expression of how you receive grace, right? So they are not incompatible. Very much like that we talked about yesterday in the sermon, right? Is that action that 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 gratitude is an actionable concept in Judaism. It means you can't help yourself, but be so grateful that you act out in the ways that God, requires us to act, asks us to act. So why do we have gospel justice ministries? Well, because we've been saved and we've been given that grace. And so we want to extend that grace to others who are not experienced, excuse me, everybody is under grace, but who are not, who have been denied the opportunity to experience that grace. Again, because of our selfishness, right? That's why we do gospel justice ministries. That's why we do justice. It's an expression of our gratitude of what we know has been given to us. So Christ has died on the cross, Christ has saved us, and we are so grateful. We want to bring that redemption to people who are not experiencing it here on earth because our selfishness has pushed them to the margins, has not been our selfishness has not allowed them to experience Easter themselves. We've stuck them in Good Friday.
Mhm.
So those two writings, those two beliefs are not incompatible. They are an extension. James's epistle is an extension of Pauline theology. And I forget how do we get here, John? There was a question
Sure,
you
I
had.
took us off the road there, sorry.
No, it's just me. I meander. I go down lots of rabbit holes in theology. But does anybody remember how we got here?
No.
I think it was about the difference between the Old and the New Testaments.
Oh yeah, remind me, Barbara.
That's all I remember.
It was about God, it was about God, that the grace is there, the redemption is there. And
Mhm.
he was following up, I think, on your point, Pastor Tammy, about the writers don't make a judgment. You have to read
Right.
it, say, well, it's
That's out.
there.
Mhm.
Whether you act in, coherently with that or not, seems to be the a thrust of the Genesis.
Yeah, that is your choice, right? And again, the consequences, right? And as Christians, we all know the consequences. And it is our choice. It is our choice, right? To act, the way of death or to act the way of life. Remember, we saw that a lot when we talked about our introduction to Genesis, right? The way of life and the way of death is that we choose which path we're going to take. And we see that in the New Testament, certainly, right? The path of life and death. And I think when we're talking about also this path of death, right? And this presumption of scarcity. We can see this in the parable of the rich fool, right? When Jesus, wants to hoard everything for themselves, right? So what is the way of death? Well, it's coveting. It is anxiety over being, am I going to get provided for or I'm not? And it's little faith, right? That's really what this story teaches us, about being covetous, about being anxious, that we feel compelled to provide and not trust. And then lastly, having little faith in God's ability to provide. And I totally get that it's hard, right? I am not here to say to you, okay, everybody just start start just acting on this faith and stop saving, stop what it's very hard today because we live in this world of scarcity. We live in this world where we have created this fear of scarcity and where this world kind of operates now on scarcity because we've all had this very selfish grab for it all. And so it makes it very hard to live in that. The way that we so what would be your solutions? How do we start living in that trust of God's providence? Right.
Well,
Well,
isn't
so
it,
the easy thing to say is,
Mhm.
don't make your focus temporal things, worldly things,
Mhm.
acquisition of things. That shouldn't be the focal point. That shouldn't be the driver of your life. Recognize, of course, we have to live. You have
Yeah,
to keep some balance. Can't just say you can't
exactly,
all be
John.
wandering prophets. But I suppose being more temperate.
Mhm.
But there's something in the penitential rite and for the Lent about our intemperate love of worldly goods or something. It's a great phrase
Yeah.
from the Most Common Prayer.
Mhm. And what does that look like in a lived daily life?
I suppose a simpler life. You don't have to have the biggest car. You don't have to have the best clothes. You don't have to, add to the list. The list can be,
Mhm.
we live in a consumer-driven society, so
Mhm.
the list is
Mhm.
virtually infinite.
Anybody else? I mean, it also looks like, and tell me if I'm wrong, but it also looks like being very Abram-like and being willing to share what we have. Right.
Yeah, that sounded to me, that was very reminiscent of all the New Testament servanthood,
Yeah.
parables, stories, statements, first
Mhm.
shall be last. You know,
Mhm.
it was like that was maybe too simplistic, but that was when I read 13, that was the biggest thing that jumped out at me. Well, this is like a preface to the various New Testament passages that talk about that, about about subordinating yourself to others.
That's very true, John. That's a very wise insight to see in that. Did anybody else recognize that in this passage? Right. That was very wise. It's a great insight. And that is the message behind that. And why is it in the New Testament? Yeah, because Jesus was a Jew.
Hmm.
Jesus grew up with the Torah, right? This is how Jesus was taught to live. He would have memorized the Torah.
I think also, I don't know how it falls into it, but I think sometimes when we're saying that people want to try to gather as much as they can and there's scarcity, it's
Mhm.
maybe because of their background and the way they grew up. If they grew up very poor
Mhm.
and then they get to a point where they can have more, they
Mhm.
tend to want to gather more to protect themselves from ever being poor again.
That's very true, Linda, and that's very wise too. Yeah, so, if you've ever worked at a pantry, at a food pantry, right? One of the biggest angst of my volunteers at St. Mark's was this. Well, they've asked for this, and I just gave them this 2 days ago, or they just asked for 5 packs of tuna, and they're only supposed to get 3. And sometimes when the social workers would go into their homes, it was that hoarding was a huge problem. And why? Because
yeah,
exactly what you said, Linda, right?
yeah.
Is that they scarcity was part of their world. It was their worldview, whether they grew up in poverty, and most of them did, most people in poverty are intergenerational. And certainly true with the people I worked with in Keensburg, it was intergenerational. They knew no different. Scarcity was the reality. And even when there was a fairly consistent supply, like, we were 5 days a week, and you could get breakfast and you could get lunch and you could take home, supper, and you could, I was very lenient, get the groceries that you needed when you needed. I know this is on tape, Jenna, but I would sometimes, many times, go against, the food
The
bank
policy. Sure.
policy, right? Right, Agnes, this, Agnes, right? And it was because people also had the psychology to scarcity, right, Agnes?
Yes,
Yeah.
absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I wish they would have had things like that when I was young and
Mm-hmm.
when my husband was young, because he was even poorer than we were. But we went through a number of years when my father had been sent home from World War II with
Mm-hmm.
extremely bleeding ulcers and was in, Veterans Hospital for months and months and almost died. And we really had nothing.
Mm-hmm.
And there weren't food banks or places that you could go and get anything like that. We had to rely on the neighbors who would give food, and my grandparents, and then Lauren's mother was widowed when Lauren was 6 months old and raised 5 kids on her own. So they were extremely poor, but they didn't have things like that. So then I always blame that on why my husband, when he got older and had the money, would always want to buy every toy that he would ever have wanted.
Yes.
A motorcycle, a Corvette, a boat, whatever he thought that he'd ever want as a child.
Yeah.
Those were the kinds of things that he wanted as an adult. So you kind of can relate to what these people back then
Yeah.
maybe wanted.
Yes, Linda, that's very brave testimony. Thank you. And very true. And very
Yeah.
true. Mm-hmm.
I used to be so mad at him when he would come home with some new thing, that he had purchased, but it made him happy.
There is a psychology, right? There is a psychology to poverty. And
Mm.
and it's psychology to need, right? And it's a really important thing that we should really educate people who work in gospel justice ministries on that, right? Because like I said, in Keensburg, the first tendency would be like you said, every time he came home with a new toy, he got mad. And that would be what would happen with our volunteers, people
Yeah,
wanted more. And there
right.
was that anger, right? So it is an understanding on our part also. Thank you for sharing that.
You're welcome.
Any other questions or comments before we say goodnight?
That was a lot.
No. Well,
It's
how
a
much
lot.
what are we supposed to read for next week?
So I would read, so moving forward, yeah, we're just going to keep plowing forward because there's really some meaty stuff in here. It gets really good after next week. Well, I don't know, the one chapter is a little dry, but so I would read 14 for next week. Excuse me, is it 14?
14
Yeah,
for
we're
next
up
month.
to 14.
Yeah, right. Lot's captivity and rescue. Now, fair warning about this one. This is a really, really dry passage. And it's a lot of names and it's a lot of kings and it's a lot of like, who knows, who cares? You really there is something to be said about this, and I promise I will say it. But really what we're really, really gonna talk about mostly is 17 through 24, which is Abram blessed by Melchizedek.
Okay.
Melchizedek is an interesting figure in the Bible. Is just out of curiosity, have anybody heard of him before?
Priest.
Yeah, he's a priest king, right?
You're a priest forever, according to
Yeah.
Melchizedek.
It's quite a mysterious figure, and lots of scholars who will give us their interpretations. But we will talk about what happens before that, right? Because it's kind of important. But the really chunk and the meat of this text is 17 through 24. And we're just, like I said, we're going to plow through this. 15 is a little bit dry, but then it gets really good because then we move into Ishmael and the sign of the covenant and
So then are we going to read through the rest of the book of Genesis?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so we'll
We
try
are.
to.
Yeah,
move
you can
through
read
it.
ahead. I mean, I would not like, I mean, some of these stories are very familiar. You're going to know them anyway. I mean, we're going to look at them in a different perspective, right? I'm okay if you read up to, I'm okay if you read up to, the end of Abram's story, which would be, 25, the death of Abram. I'm okay if you read up to that.
Okay.
So that's fine. I mean, some of it's a little bit heavy but that's okay. You can do that. Some of it we might not talk fully about, but my goal is to move through this whole book because I'm hoping that it's making a difference to you, right? I'm hoping that you're seeing it in a new light, and I'm hoping that you're like, yeah, this is something that I can work on myself. I mean, was tonight like more enlightening than you thought it would be?
Yes.
Yeah, yeah.
I'm hoping that maybe we move a little faster because we got stuck on those first
Mhm.
few chapters of Genesis. It seems like we went over them over and over and over again. So
Okay.
it would be nice if we could really plunge ahead and keep going forward.
Yeah, we're going to keep the pace. We're going to go do at least one chapter a week.
Okay.
I mean, sometimes if we can combine some, we will. There are some spots in, I think, Isaac's story we can. It gets really exciting with Jacob again, though. In fact, this
It goes
week's
up to 50, right? It goes
it
up to
does, but yeah, and then it goes on to Joseph, which is really exciting too. That's a great story. And yeah, so do read that for next week. Kind of focus on 17 through 24. Read through the really hard stuff, and then focus on 17 and 24, and then we'll be back next week.
Yay.
So cool.
All right.
And if you have
This
any
was
questions,
wonderful.
just reach out. It's good to
Will
see
do.
everyone again.
Have a
good night.
Everybody enjoy the
Thank
week.
you,
God
Tammy.
bless. Welcome back, Barbara.
Thanks.
Bye.
Bye.